Good evening, all. I'm going to give it a minute just for people to trickle in. You should see a poll launch as you come in. So if you don't mind filling that out. And like I said, we'll get started in just 30 seconds here. Okay. We're going to slowly start here. As I mentioned, if you're just coming in, you'll see a poll launch. We'll have a couple more of those at the very end. My name is Tal Kitron with Applerouth Tutoring. I've been with the company for, 11 or 12 years now, working primarily as a tutor, doing SAT and ACT prep, as well as some executive function coaching. Today we're here, many of you may have joined last week to talk about the math strategies. Today we're just going to do the verbal sections. We'll talk about some tips, some tricks, and then just how to master the strategy and knowing what to expect really on the verbal sections. As we go today, if you have questions, go ahead and put them in the Q&A. I'll make sure I get to those at the end. We are booked for an hour. I don't think this will take that long. I think it'll probably be more like 40 minutes or so. And then, yeah, like I said, time for any sort of questions you guys have about the test or about the standardized testing process and so on. So for starters, what are we going to cover? The format of the SAT verbal modules and the format of the SAT generally. Main focus is going to be the verbal content as well as strategies we can use for each type of question. And that also includes pacing and timing strategies, especially when we get to the upper level module, which we'll talk about. And then just techniques that you can immediately apply to your official SAT or practice SAT if you've got one of those coming up. So many of you know this, but the structure and the scoring, there are 4 sections to the SAT. The first 2 sections are verbal. The next 2 are math. This is true of the PSAT as well. The scoring of those tests is a tiny bit different. So for SAT, it is out of 1,600. That's verbal out of 800. So those first 2 sections and then the second 2, math, are also scored out of 800. Those are just added together for your total score. So if you get a 600 on verbal and a 750 on math, you would add it together and have a 1350 overall. I bolded the verbal since that's what we are covering today. This test is section adaptive. And what that means is on section 2, which is the second verbal section, and section 4, which is the second and last math section, you can expect those sections to be either quite a bit harder than the first or quite a bit easier. So again, based on how you perform in section 1, so like module 1 verbal is just 27 questions. We'll talk through the structure. And your job is going to be to get, as many of course as we can correct. But let's say we get 21 or 22 out of 27 correct on module 1. I think that's about the cutoff. If you get more than about 21 or 22 of those correct, the second module is going to adapt and be quite a bit harder. And that's what we want. We do not want the second section to be easier, because what that means is maybe we missed we only got like 18 right out of 27. We missed 9 or 10. And at that point, if you miss more than that on section 1, you're probably going to go into the lower bracket, the lower module. Everything will be easier in section 2, but that means your score ceiling and score floor are quite a bit lower. So the most important thing on this test is really modules 1 and 3 and acing those. You have a lot more leeway to miss questions on the upper level sections and still get a fantastic score. Because remember, the SAT is graded on a curve. So you're graded based on how you perform compared to others who are taking the same test as you, for the same test sitting. And then it is not question adaptive. So I do think on math, it tends to get harder as we go. But on verbal, it's more about where the certain question types are. I'm not going to say that question 18 is going to be harder than question 14, right? It's usually quite the opposite. So some basics, because the SAT changed a couple of years ago, became digital and became shorter. But despite being a shorter test, we actually have fewer questions, so there's more time per question. Most of my students in tutoring, I do find run out of time on module 2 and sometimes module 3. But I will say that it's much rarer than it used to be. Used to also be reading and writing were different sections. There was an English, and then there was a reading, kind of like the ACT does. But now they're combined, and there's very few grammatical concepts. We'll talk about what they are, but it's like 6-ish. And now the passages are shorter. So we'll have one paragraph, one question, rather than 5 paragraphs, 10 questions attached. Format continued. So the verbal, which we're here to talk about today, is 27 questions in 32 minutes. So 54 total, but section 1 is 27 questions in 32 minutes. Section 2 is 27 questions in 32 minutes. Of those 27 questions, 2 of them won't end up counting. So they're experimental, they're pre-test questions. But as test takers, we can't really worry about that. Right. So I think instead of thinking about that, just realize I can't spend too long on any one question. I have to get as many points as I can. We're not going to be able to predict which are the questions they're going to throw out and not grade. So this is just for your own knowledge, but it's not really important as far as test prep or test taking. And the total for the whole test, which includes the 10-minute break between verbal and math, is 2 hours, 24 minutes, way shorter than it used to be, which was more like 3 hours. Nice for students who have extended time because of ADHD, for example, because yes, we get the extended time we need, but we're not stuck in the test center for 5 hours. It's more like 3.5 or 4. So let's get into the actual question types and strategies. Again, I mentioned 32 minutes, 27 questions. We have a little bit more than a minute per question, but not all questions are created equal. Some will take longer, some will be really short. Either way, so like the longest you'll see is 2 paragraphs, and it's very rare. Generally, you'll have 1 paragraph, 1 question, all multiple choice on verbal. And that's what we see on the left-hand side. These are 2 vocab questions, which we'll delve into. But you can see it's just short and sweet, right? We don't spend much time with each set of information anymore on the SAT verbal. So now we're going to kind of dig in. And this is the stuff that, like, this is what I teach in a tutoring session. I'm not going to hide the ball whatsoever. I want to give you guys the best chance to succeed when it comes to prep and the test itself. So we'll dig into most of these. But the first thing to know is that the questions are going to start with vocab. You do not have to start there. And to be honest, for most students on especially upper level module 2, they should not start there. Instead, we'll probably start at like question 16, because the grammar, the connectors, the bullet point questions, they're not easy by any means, but they're quicker. And if you master the rules, they can be easier. Understand that the long questions are in the middle. So after vocab, we get these longer command of evidence, purpose, cross-text connections, inference, always in the middle. So the biggest mistake I see students make is we just start, we're going 1 through 10, right? We're cruising kind of around 9 or 10. It starts to be like, oh God, that's a lot of long questions. And then all of a sudden we're at question 12 or 13 and we realize, oh crap, I have 10 minutes left and 15 questions. So to avoid that, and we'll keep kind of thinking about it as we go today, but skip around. So like one strategy is you could do the first, let's say 7 questions. So the 4 vocab and a few of the long ones. But then there's like 20, 25 minutes left. We should jump forward and let's do 16 through 27 because those are the easy points. I don't want to run out of time on those. I'll come back and finish on 8 through 15. And if, God forbid, I do run out of time here, at least I'm doing that on the hardest questions that I might have missed anyway and the most involved. It is better to miss a question in 30 seconds than to get it right in 3 minutes. If you're taking 2 or 3 minutes to get a question, it's too long. You won't get to everything. So at that point, you should just mark it for review and move on. Something I've seen more of recently is instead of this strategy, people just go straight to 16 through 27 and then work their way back through, which I don't mind. At least we're definitely getting to the grammar stuff early and making sure we nail it. But then you've got 15 or 16 kind of long and difficult questions at the end. So that comes with practice, right? I would just say, I'll give you resources for practice tests, but try to find your comfort zone. What allows you to finish on time and with confidence that you've gotten to everything. All right, so this is really kind of the heart of today and what we're going to talk about. This is what you'll see when you start an SAT. And if the Zoom like toolbar is in your way, you can slide that around, or if my camera's in the way, I'll actually slide that right now a little bit. Just kind of noting what you've got. So up top, we have the time that starts to tick down. That can be freaky for some people. So some people just hide it. Most don't, right? I want to kind of know how much time we have. And so then as soon as you click in, you'll see that clicking down, you'll see the passage on the left, you see the question on the right. Important things to note. Number one is mark for review. So that would just make a little flag by this question. We would know either I answered it or didn't answer it, but either way, I'm going to come back. And then when you hit the black button where it says question 1 of 27 on the bottom of the screen, you'll see all the questions, including ones you haven't answered and ones you've marked. So this is a great way to just remind yourself, I can't spend too long. I'm going to mark it for review, move on. The annotate tool on the top right, I don't find most students using it. I think that it used to be like we had a hard copy test booklet, so we'd actively read, we'd write it all down, mark it up, underline, circle, star, take notes. But now it's online. I think if you're a visual person and the highlighting helps, you can highlight things just by using your mouse to highlight with a cursor. But the most important by far in verbal is going to be that ABC/, which is the answer eliminator. I would always have it engaged. And on verbal, way more than math, it's really useful. We don't really answer just by picking a good answer. Instead, we think like the writers, see the 3 bad answers, and eliminate to get to the best. So that's the basics of what you'll see. And this is all via the Blue Book app, which you have to download. Many of you would take this either on a computer provided by the school or just on your own laptop or device. Okay, let's talk specifics, starting up with vocab and context. Again, questions 1 through 4 usually. So this is the first thing you'll see. The language of which choice completes the text with the most logical and precise word or phrase, that's boilerplate. We don't want to have to read that because every vocab question uses those words. And our strategy is really as follows. And this is a bit of overkill for some questions, but I think in the grand scheme of things, a lot of vocab questions are hard enough that this is the right move. So first step is we're going to mask the choices. There's a tool where you can physically do that on Blue Book or just ignore them briefly. Then we read the passage. We'll predict a word or phrase of our own. Frustrated with the blank of existing terms, this author coined the term African futurism to describe the genre of science fiction that is rooted in African experiences and perspectives, and that focuses on what is and can or will be rather than what could have been. But back to the beginning, before he coined the term, he's frustrated with something. So frustrated with the, I don't know, lack of existing terms, something like that, something negative. Then we bring the answers back and eliminate the ones that definitely do not work. So like here, he wouldn't be frustrated with the variety or the precision. That's a positive word. If they're precise, this author wouldn't be frustrated. We're down to 2. Some people don't know what obscurity means, which doesn't mean we cross it out. It just means we test limitations first. And this is a word we know, and it really does work. Frustrated with the limitations of existing terms, that's great. Obscurity would mean that they're kind of hard to access or find. Things can be obscured by time, for example, or you can just be hidden and obscured that way. It's not a terrible answer because it's negative, which is what we need, but B is better. It's mathematical, really. It's methodical. It's not looking for the best choice. It's the least bad, the one we can't argue with. And that strategy can be repeated over and over again for every vocab question, of which there are generally eight. 8 out of 54 questions are vocab. Focus less on trying to memorize new words and doing flashcards and more on the context part and are we predicting the right type of word or phrase. Next is command of evidence. And so this would be in the 5 through 15 range, the middle questions, the long questions. And these come in the form of like verbal, so poetry or just like a paragraph, sciencey stuff, and then also sometimes graphs, which we'll talk about later. The job here is different. It's not rocket science, but we've got an actual question, not a boilerplate language question that says the same thing every time, but an actual question. So our job would first be read that. Then we'll read the passage. It's not like AP tests. Some of them were going to the answer choices first is smart. Rather, we go to the passage and maybe predict, but really it's just then we'll come to the answers and eliminate them. So for this question, which is a hard one, I think, it's saying which choice most or which quotation most effectively illustrates the claim. Let's go look at the passage, which is short, and figure out what the claim is. The Spring is a poem. In the poem, the speaker compares the changes in the season to the attitude of his beloved. So we need a comparison. We need something about nature or seasonal changes to a person's attitude, his beloved being the woman or person he's in love with. So I look at A and I'm thinking, oh gosh, this is definitely 17th century poetry language, and I hate it. Now that the winter's gone, the earth hath lost her snow white robes. Well, I definitely see seasonal changes. I'm not sure about her. I would keep A. B seems like it's all about the seasonal changes. I don't get anything about a person's attitude. I can confidently cross out B as in boy. C, same thing. Honestly, doesn't go changes or attitude, but just talks about like a birds and nature. So not B, not C. And then let's unpack this monstrosity of choice D. Nor hath the scalding noonday sun the power to melt that marble ice which still doth hold her heart congealed and makes her pity cold. So it sounds like it's hot, the scalding noonday sun, but it can't melt the ice. And then there's this like mention of someone's heart and her pity. I think that's a person. I'm picking choice D without understanding it fully. A says her, but that's personifying the earth. It's not like a person's attitude. So I can't pick A confidently, but I'd be down to A and D, and hopefully we pick choice D. Either way, take a minute max and then move on. Right. So a lot of people, understandably, really don't love these questions. Same thing here, and the language of inference will always be the same, but you have to read it. Which choice most logically completes the text? An inference is almost an assumption. It's like I'm going to make a leap of judgment from information I have. I'll make an inference to understand, okay, what's happened next or what's the meaning. On the SAT, you do not want to really infer or assume anything. Never bring in outside knowledge. These long passages and questions are always the same. It's read the question, read the passage, eliminate. Do not pick a good answer. It's really hard. Do not gravitate towards a good answer. I cannot stress that enough. Instead, think like the basement dwelling test writers who write test questions all day, every day, and say, all right, let me figure out what are the words they use to make these answers bad. And then you're down to hopefully, 2 or maybe 1 answer. And we want just one that says, I can't argue with that. Not I love it, not it's perfect, but yeah, can't argue with that. It's true. We won't do this question, but I would say a lot of my students find these to be the most burdensome. So it's a great candidate for if you get stuck or you're confused, to skip past it. And then do as you read, note like connector words. So there's a however in there, right? That's the kind of thing that would be important. If you see therefore, however, consequently, that shows what comes next is important. Next, we got rhetorical synthesis or rhetoric questions. These are at the end, 25, 26, 27. A big mistake would be to not get to these and just have to guess because they're pretty fast. For most of them, we can ignore the bullet points and just go straight to the right-hand side. For example, here our job is read the question. The student wants to introduce the research of Aubrey and Schmidt to an audience already familiar with global warming. Well, I can go to the answers and just take away any answers that do not introduce these people's research, which would be A, does not mention those people at all for their research, and D. Right, I go down the list, but I'd keep these two and cross out A and D. B kind of makes it seem like global warming is something we don't know about, and it doesn't introduce the research that well. So I don't love it. I think C is probably a better answer. I would use the bullets if I need to, but it's talking about the two scientists, it's saying what they do, and it's talking about mitigating global warming as if we already know what that is. So we're already familiar. Didn't really need to look at the bullets at all. And I would say 4 out of 5 types of questions like this, you won't need them. The hardest ones recently on module 2 upper level have required the bullet points because there's multiple answers that answer the question. This is really important, clauses and punctuation. If there was on verbal, if there was one thing that I had to give someone advice to study, so like let's say you've got 2 days before the SAT and you're like, hey, what do I study? This is not a test to cram for, but I would go to this. Got to know how to place commas and what they do and don't do. Got to understand periods and semicolons for sure. And then also got to be comfortable with what a colon does. Commas are the hardest of the bunch by far because they separate ideas. Could be dependent, independent, independent, dependent, but a bunch of other things too. Whereas periods and semicolons are very, very direct and simple. They have like a sweet, crisp rule, which is got to separate 2 full sentences. She prepared for the test, period. She studied hard. You have to have 2 independent clauses for either, which means on this test, they're usually identical. So like 29 times out of 30, there is one exception, but almost always if you see a period and a semicolon, they're the same. And therefore they'd both be wrong usually. And then for a colon, don't think list. Instead, think must follow a full sentence. That is a rule we can rely on, which makes them easier to test than commas. And got to introduce whatever comes after. So I had one great passion in life. The colon is like a drum roll, please. I had one great passion in life. Drum roll, please. What was it? Making pizzas. So standard English conventions is what this is called, aka grammar and clauses. And like I said, number one thing to make sure you know, because these are the easy points. And honestly, sometimes they're worth more from what I've heard. So just have to nail these questions. Here's what they would look like. Straight to the answer choices. Anytime you see a grammar question, clauses specifically, but grammar from about 16 to about 21 or 22, straight to the choices, because that'll tell you what they're testing. In this case, very clearly clauses and punctuation. Then we'll read the short passage, or at least the sentence that matters. As always, we will eliminate. That is the word of the day for verbal. And we'll pick the answer that doesn't violate any rules. It's grammatically correct, right? The wrong answers on this, we can prove are wrong. And here, I kind of already know that A and B are wrong because they're the same as each other. And I can't have 2 right answers, so they're both wrong. Here's why. When you read a name, by the way, you can always just put in your own name or just she or BP or whatever. You don't have to read the whole name. In this case, this person is perhaps best known for writing and illustrating children's books, such as The Tale of Peter Rabbit, but she also dedicated herself to mycology, the study of fungi. That's a full sentence. So up to this point, A and B look good. But then the second part says, producing more than 350 paintings of the fungal species she observed and submitting her research on spore germination to the Linnean Society of London. It's like, what? What about that? There's no subject or verb there. So that's why A and B are wrong, because they separate an independent from a dependent. So we look at C and D and decide, do we need a pause or not? In this case, we do. The correct answer is D, because the producing idea is a new and different idea from what she was dedicating herself to studying. Elimination is the key, and then there are rules you can rely on. Trusting your ear is good, but that should not be like what you rely on, at least as your first step. Trust your ear as the last resort. The other grammar topics you'll see, and again, it's very finite. There aren't that many. Verb tense, past, present, future, easy. But you have to really be careful that that's not subject-verb agreement. So those would be more like is versus are, was, were, has, have. These are all things you can practice. Misplaced modifiers are when a subject is moving around in the answer choices. So we have to figure out, based on context, what should the first word be usually, like a person or a thing. Possession, so apostrophes, and then its versus its. And then we did some, but fragments, run-ons, and lots of different punctuation and clauses stuff. Can't emphasize enough that grammar is always like 16 to 21 or 15 to 22. So if you're skipping around, that's where you jump to start off on the grammar, around question 15 usually. Right after grammar, we see connectors. So this is before the bullet point questions, but after the subject, verb, and tense and clauses. So it's around question 22 or 23 to about 25. And it's important because there are 3 or 4 of them on each module. So 6 to 8 out of 54 questions. And again, answer choices first. Go straight to A, B, C, and D to see their testing connectors. Then we read the passage to decide if there's contrast or not. Based on that, hopefully we can eliminate some answers and then pick the one that works grammatically, but also makes sense. Here, organisms have evolved a number of surprising adaptations to ensure their survival in adverse conditions. Tadpole shrimp embryos, blank, can pause development for over 10 years during extended periods. Well, this is not a contrast, so it's not A, or C for that matter. And I don't think it's cause and effect. Consequently is like therefore or thus. So in this case, I'd pick B, for example, as the answer that makes the most sense. And you can see, even if we miss this question, it's not going to take forever, which is good. That's why these questions could be nice to get to early on, even though they're towards the end. And then finally, graph questions. So this is out of order because these are going to come in the middle. They're command of evidence. But just a quick note on graph questions, which some people love and some students really don't. On module 1, like the standard section, oftentimes 3 of the choices will just be false. Like you look at the graph and the answers, you'll be like, wait a second, that's not even true. And then, let me move my. And then on module 2 upper level, what'll more often happen is they'll all be true. And that's really hard. Those will take longer. They're great candidates to skip because you really have to delve into the passage and the graph and the answers and understand a lot about it. Strategy remains pretty much the same, which is question first. Right, so that's right here. Then passage, assuming we have time. If we're really short on time, maybe we have to jump here, but that's not ideal. So really it's question, then passage, then answers, and we look at choice A, compare it to the graph, and see if it's true and relevant. So like I said, some people really don't love these. Others do great with data interpretation. Either way, practice makes perfect. So just to recap, and then we'll talk a little bit about like how to prepare and open it up for questions. Like I said, definitely not going to take the full hour today. Answer what the question's actually asking. So we didn't talk much about it, but If it's a grammar question, we don't even need the question. We go straight to the choices. But if it's a question where we have to illustrate a claim, pay attention to detail, figure out what the claim is. Leave nothing blank. There's no guessing penalty. There are no points off for wrong answers. And there's no free response. Everything is A, B, C, D, 1 out of 4 chance at worst. So consider skipping around, like we said a bunch of times, to get the easiest points for you, whether that's grammar or rhetoric or something else, and mark questions for review as needed, but just don't leave them blank, right? If you run out of time, come back and pick like B for each of them. And just like we need to use the Desmos calculator on math, don't forget to use the answer eliminator on verbal, right? I would say always have it engaged. And that'll just remind you not to go to a good answer, but rather to think like a test writer. I think that's super important. So let's revisit the structure because I think that's probably the number one takeaway that I want people to have here. And that is that the first 4 are vocab. You don't have to start with them. The next 10 or 11 are the hardest for most, the longest questions. Command evidence, inference, stuff with like main idea or purpose, cross-text connections. There's only one of those per section. But all those long questions are going to be about reading question, passage, and eliminating. So they just take more energy and time. But then we get to the promised land of grammar, 16-ish to 21, maybe 15 to 22. Then connectors, and then rhetoric. And for those last 11 or 12 questions, you must get to them with plenty of time and energy to spare, even if it means you're going out of order. I really like going out of order. I think it helps you take ownership of your process. So I'd recommend it for almost everybody. Like even if you have time and a half and you're not running out of time, it's still probably good to keep your mind fresh and not just dwell on a bunch of long questions in a row, right? Change of pace is good. So how do we practice? Applerouth, our company, has 4 tests that are really good, honestly. They've been revised recently to kind of match more current versions of the real test. What's best about those is you get a detailed score report with analysis of the types of questions. Those can be used to identify where do I need to focus my energy. College Board also has 8 Blue Book SATs, so all via the app, and 3 PSATs. So if like you're in 10th grade thinking about that for next year. If you Google SAT Suite Question Bank, it's an educator resource, but it's anyone can use it. And it allows you to filter by question type and difficulty level. So once you've done some of these tests and you know where you struggle, that can help you focus in. Or maybe like if you had a day before the SAT, you can go in there and look at standard English conventions or some geometry and trig, for example. And then like whatever happens on these tests, like this test scores do not define us. This is just a standardized test. It takes most people 2 or 3 times to reach their full potential. Got to do practice tests and practice on your own. It's really a test of effort. It is not a test of intelligence for better and for worse, right? There are like 8 types of intelligence. The SAT arguably tests 2 of them. So intelligence, sure, it helps, but it's really about putting in the work, understanding what to expect, which hopefully today went a long way towards that, and then practicing over and over again until you understand here's what I'm missing, here's how I can avoid it. As we open it up for questions, just to note that these are our cornerstones. So the 2 I do is test prep and executive function coaching. But if you're interested in getting a custom recommendation, you can call this number and I'll pull it up on a different slide as well. But academic tutoring would be like AP is coming up or a subject in school we're studying with or for, and then test prep is SAT, ACT, PSAT for the most part. And then EF coaching is more about planning, prioritizing, organizational skills, which a lot of us need, especially in transition times. Going to launch another poll. And I really want to note this, that there's a couple of really cool webinars coming up, May 4th and May 6th. This is a very rare opportunity to hear from both college counselors and admissions officers on what happened in this latest admissions cycle. And as you can see, these people have like tons and tons of experience. And Jed is actually the founder of this company and great guy, very insightful and really, really a genius. Very good to listen to him talk about anything really. So if you're interested in that, launch that poll and you can just enter your email there. These are free and I highly recommend them. And then finally, I want to open it up for questions. We will launch one final poll. The recording of this will be sent out, I believe, tomorrow. It might be next Friday, but usually it's the Friday the week we do it. So you should receive this presentation. But yeah, if you have questions, let's see them. And if you don't and feel like you want to call it an evening, hope you got a lot out of it, and definitely feel free to do that too. And I appreciate you joining. But yeah, let's open it up for questions and just see if you have any about SAT verbal or anything else. And then you just saw that third poll launch. Of course, if you're shy or you think of a question later, you can always shoot an email to info@applerouth.com. And if you want to connect with me specifically, just ask for Tal. First question is a good one. The question is specifically studying vocabulary words beneficial, and what is the best way to do that? Um, yes and no. I think if you're at a pretty high level and you know that one of the very few things you're struggling with is advanced vocab, then yeah, flashcards and vocabulary words, just like repetition is good. But it wouldn't be my first um, go around. I would say first grammar and the connectors and the longer questions and vocab strategy. And then if you're like at a super high level, trying to go from like a 1400 to a 1500, that's when maybe I'd bring in the vocab. Um, if you even just Google SAT vocab Reddit, Reddit's got a couple good lists. But ultimately, any vocabulary resource you're using is a good one. You want to probably just pick, I don't know, 10 words per day, 50 per week. So my strategy would be do those 10 words per day, memorize 10 new words, write down the definition or sentence, and then at the end of the week, come back and make sure that all 50 I have down. And if there's a few that aren't sticking, I would stick those to the side. So the short answer is yes, vocab is beneficial, but I would probably only be doing it if I was a super high scorer and struggling with that specifically. Next question is about admissions and like just standardized testing generally. How many schools now demand the SAT as part of the application? There are quite a few schools that are still test optional, but since COVID, like the end of the main part of the COVID pandemic, many schools have gone back to requiring SAT or ACT. So it's hard to say how many schools, right? Because there are thousands and thousands. A majority of schools do require an SAT or ACT score. But no school would prefer SAT over ACT or vice versa. And you should just check the admissions policy because there are plenty of schools still, some elite schools, that have a test optional like path to apply. The data do show that even those test optional schools, you get a pretty good advantage from taking an SAT if you get a good score. So not every school demands it or requires an SAT or ACT, but most do. And even if they don't, it's usually a good thing for people to try to open up opportunities. But it isn't for everyone. And it pays my bills, but sometimes the standardized testing world is silly, right? It's just you got to prepare for this one specific test. And that's why I always recommend to take it 2 or 3 times so you're not putting pressure on just one go around. Yeah, those are good questions. I'll leave it open for a couple more minutes just to see if any others come in. I'm guessing this is early action and early decision is the question. Um, It doesn't matter. Generally, if a school requires an SAT or ACT for regular admission cycles, they'll also require it for early action and early decision. But again, look at the specific schools, and that's something to look at if you are committed to a couple of schools or one especially that you really want to go to, and they don't require the test, then maybe that's a good option. Do early action, early decision without an SAT, and then if you get in, right, definitely there will be some people who get into those test optional schools without a standardized test. Seeing no more questions, definitely do, like I said, reach out if anything comes up and just practice, get to know the test. This is a test you can improve on, and no matter what happens, right, like I said, those scores don't define us. It's just a test at the end of the day. Hope you guys got a lot out of this. I appreciate you joining. Have a wonderful rest of the evening and week.